last Sunday of Epiphany for this year, and next week begins Lent. And as I mentioned last week, as Trinity Place looks for my replacement, a new priest, I've been planning for what's next for me. And though it's not exactly appropriate for a sermon, I would like to tell you two of the things that are next for my ministry. The second one is the lead-in to today's comments on the Transfiguration story. First and most immediate is that my publisher has released the publication date of my next book, which is December 10th, and it's a memoir in poetry and prose, actually more prose by volume than poetry, but it isn't a juicy tell-all book. It is a personal perspective on 40 years as a priest, what I saw, heard, learned, felt, was amazed by. And I'm not sure it will gain a huge audience, but the marketing and the business end of it has already begun, so that's now. The other thing that relates a little to this sermon anyway is that I plan to offer podcasts through my website here and iTunes and YouTube. Now the cool thing about that for me is that I no longer have to follow the lectionary, the new revised lectionary. I may never have to preach on the Transfiguration story ever again. Woohoo! I have struggled for 40 years with this story, and actually longer if you consider 3 years of seminary. So now I can ignore it or just use it as an illustration. In other words, I will become unmoored, untethered, reckless, and who knows what. So stay tuned to see how that turns out. But as for the Transfiguration story, one more time. Now, I'm not sure I have a whole lot new to say about this that I haven't mentioned before and previously, but that doesn't mean that there is nothing new here to think about. If we think of Mark's story as the sort of projected image of the great and terrible Oz before Toto unveiled the professor, then we can go behind the curtain of the supernatural and see what's there. There is something interesting to think about here. Oppressive rulers and empires, even our own, do all that they can to ensure that the memory of their enemies either disappears into nothingness or lives on in infamy. So, for example, our own leaders had Osama bin Laden's body tossed into the ocean so there'd be no shrine for the deposition of reverences. You see, it isn't just long ago history. But even so, some outsiders, revolutionary and revenants, live on in the myth and the legends that elevate their lives above the ruling historians and the natural dust of history. There is official history told by the victors, and then there's the people's history kept alive by folk memory. Now, the only way that folk memory survives official memory is if it has something seeded in it that resonates as truer than the official truth. So, for example, the histories of the Roman emperors remain, and even many of the pharaohs. But I dare say the stories of Moses and Elijah and Jesus have been shared more broadly and have perhaps been more influential on subsequent human history than any emperor or pharaoh. What Mark wants us to know, or wanted his peers to know, because truly I don't think Mark could have imagined that his papyrus would be around 2,300 years later. What he wants us to know is that Jesus was as great as Moses and Elijah. Now, this is one way to unpack a biblical story, by the way. We do not have to believe it is a factual rendering of an actual moment in history to learn something from it. Whether it's factual or not, either way, it holds meaning. In other words, the meaning of the story, its truth, has nothing to do with whether it actually happened or not, or very little. The meaning of this story, is, as told by Mark, is that Mark believed Jesus was one of the greatest prophets of all time. Moses and Elijah are like the digital link that you can click on to get to another website. They link Jesus to the ultimate authority, God. And the way Mark tells it, at his baptism, no one hears God tell Jesus that he is his beloved. It's a voice Jesus hears and no one else. In other words, Jesus' baptism is a private spiritual experience, awakening. In Mark's gospel anyway, now Luke and Matthew modify that a bit, but zoom ahead to chapter 9 in Mark and something new happens, the Transfiguration, which is a different kind of baptism. Another thing we need to notice about the Transfiguration is where it's located in Mark's larger story. It falls just before the last week, Holy Week as we call it. You see, in Mark, half the gospel tells the story of the first 3 years of Jesus' ministry, and the second half of the gospel tells the last week. 8 chapters for 3 years, 8 chapters for 1 week. The Transfiguration is part of the hinge between those two sagas. So as we get ready to hear about the last week of Jesus' life, Mark tells us about this event on the mountain and verifies it with witnesses so that everybody now knows that Jesus is God's beloved. The Transfiguration is Jesus' coming out party. But here's something I have mentioned in the past when we've had Mark in front of us. Mark tells us that Jesus is God's Son, but not God's only Son. In Mark, Jesus is not elevated at the expense of Moses and Elijah. When reading Mark, never mind what orthodoxy says about it. Our earliest gospel does not say Jesus is God's only Son. In fact, at the very beginning of Mark's gospel, it reads, "This is the beginning of the good news about Jesus Christ, Son of God." But some of the earliest Greek texts we have of Mark omit the whole phrase Son of God. The text simply begins, "This is the beginning of the good news about Jesus Christ." So you see, in Judaism, a prophet need not be the only prophet in order to be an important presence or to speak for God. A prophet, by nature being a prophet, voices God. The emphasis in the Jewish text, I think, is in discerning true prophets from false prophets, rather than which is the only prophet. For a variety of historical reasons, Christianity could not live with this idea, and so it painted itself into a theological corner by declaring that Jesus is the only. And if he's not the only, then he's nothing at all. That's what the Orthodox Church Fathers declared. And by the way, but if we unpeel the layers of Christian interpretation, shellacking this story from Mark, we can see that Mark's claim for Jesus is something much less complex than what Orthodoxy has made it. He is a prophet as great as Moses and Elijah. Being Messiah or Christ does not negate that he is a prophet. And the real intent of this story, from the storyteller's point of view, is simply to say, hey, listen up, because this guy speaks with authority. This guy's the real thing. That's the truth of Mark's Transfiguration story. That's the truth that it holds, not whether or not it really happened. It's a story to tell us that we need to listen to this guy because there has never been anyone greater. He's the real thing. So I'm not plumbing some deep, profound spiritual wisdom here. We're limited by the lectionary after all. But it is an important truth we need to keep front and center all the time in contemporary spiritual communities. We need to be very roomy, holding Orthodox believers and evangelical believers and progressively Christian believers and marginal believers and even non-believers. Who we are and what we are from the very beginning of this movement has been roomy and wide open for all kinds of believers and non-believers. In Mark's story of the Last Supper, Jesus doesn't kick Judas out. He leaves of his own accord. Jesus doesn't kick Peter out for saving his own rear end. Jesus doesn't kick Thomas out for not believing what his eyes never saw. We should be able to look at one another in the eyes, every single one of us, and embrace each other with all the differences of our beliefs and with all that we do not believe. Because in the end, community, spiritual community, is not about beliefs. It's spiritual community, particularly Episcopal spiritual community, is about sharing the gospel as agents of God's love, with whatever capacities we have and with whatever gifts or limitations we have to do it. The depth and breadth and size of our community is measured by how we love, not what we believe or don't believe. How great is our love? How fierce is our love? How courageous is our love? How unbounded is our love? Those are the questions about our hearts and the questions about our spiritual practice. Beliefs pale in comparison to those. And that is the truth of Mark's story. Peace be with you.